Today's book is Uncovering Grammar by Scott Thornbury. Now, if you couldn't already tell from the title, this is not pleasure reading exactly. This is one of the books I've done for professional development. Although that being said, as these books go, it was a fairly painless read. Dare I even say pleasurable, maybe? But it's not a novel. It's a book for English teachers about uncovering grammar. Scott Thornbury. This is the third book by Scott Thornbury I've read. I've previously read Beyond the Sentence and About Language, and then this one. Although About Language doesn't really count, because About Language is kind of more like a workbook, where you kind of do the exercises and then check your answers in the back. So not counting About Language, I guess, is the second Scott Thornbury book I've read. Now, if you're not familiar with Scott Thornbury, you probably wouldn't be watching this video because why would you click on this? But if you're not familiar with Scott Thornbury, he is probably the most famous person writing in English language teaching, and at least in the pedagogical side of things. Maybe you could make the argument that other people like Krashen or something are more famous on the theoretical side of things. But as far as writing these how to teach books, I think Scott Thornbury is kind of the most famous name in the business. So if you're in teaching English, you probably already know about him. And as I was reading this book, I thought, well, this guy deserves his reputation. He just explains everything so well. And he's taking these kind of fairly complex topics. It's a short and painless little book, but he delves into some kind of complex topics here about how the human brain kind of learns grammar. Complex to a degree. And he just explains everything so well. He'll give an example. He'll start out with an anecdote, storytelling. And then he'll say, okay, now why did this happen? Why was there this problem with the grammar? And then he'll give several other examples and he'll kind of build up a case. And it's just like a masterful piece of explaining. And boy, when you get an author who does this well, it's important to take that into account, because boy, are there ever a lot of authors who don't do that well. And to be fair, explaining something is difficult. I don't explain things well myself, because there's this Steven Pinker video where he talks about this on YouTube, the curse of knowledge. The idea that when you know something, it's very difficult for you to assume the position of somebody who doesn't know something and to kind of explain it sufficiently to kind of get something across from your head into somebody else's head. I mention that because Scott Thornbury does not have that problem. He knows, even though he's been writing in ELT for years, he kind of so perfectly understands the mindset of the novice teacher, like somebody who doesn't know all this linguistic stuff, and he just so perfectly explains everything to him. We did this book as a book club at work, and there was one of the comments somebody made is I really enjoyed this book. He's like, this was so much easier than the last book we read, so much clearer. And yeah, I have to agree, it's just a really easy to read, kind of clear book. My manager told me at one point, I'm kind of taking his word for this, he said Scott Thornbury kind of has a bad reputation among linguists, because what he does is he takes ideas that other people have come up with and he just kind of rewrites them as his own. And I probably shouldn't actually be repeating that, because I've never actually kind of verified that for myself. I'm probably just passing on hearsay at this point or whatever. But I don't know. I can imagine it. A lot of this book, actually, was retreading Rod Ellis, which, to Thornberry's credit, he says that right at the beginning, and he's kind of got his references cited and stuff like that. But in particular, Rod Ellis' book that I actually read a few years back, which is SLA Research and Language Teaching. Is that the name of the book? Something like that. Yeah, SLA Research and Language Teaching. Ellis kind of talks about some of these concepts that are kind of, Thornberry recycles them in this book. But Thornberry's version is just so much more easy to read. Like Rod Ellis is not easy to read at all. But I had kind of encountered some of this theory before, kind of from Rod Ellis's book. But then there was a couple new things in here as well. I don't know. So the basic view, like he starts off, I guess, kind of talking about like what is grammar. And he talks about how grammar is created by distance. He's got this great example here kind of right at the beginning of like a conversation that takes place between two people. Here it is. Coffee, please. Milk, sugar, no milk, one sugar, thanks. Toast, no thanks. Juice, and he says like, there's no grammar in here at all. And it's completely different than what you would present with a student with in your typical ESL textbook. But he says like, why is there no grammar in this sentence? And the reason there's no grammar is because, for one thing, it's between two people who know each other very well. So there's kind of no social distance between them. And for another thing, they're referring to objects right in front of them, like milk, and you're holding the milk as you say it, or something like that. So everything is exactly right here and now. So there's no need for grammar. But if these were two people who didn't know each other, then there would be social distance, and then there would be a need for grammar. Or if these were two people removed in time or space, like, calling up on the telephone or something like that, where the objects weren't right in front of them, then the spatial distance would create need for grammar. Now that's not removed in time, that's just removed in space. But you can imagine like removed in time, like, writing a letter to somebody who's not going to get it to next week or something like that. And that creates a need for grammar. And I thought all of that was kind of very interesting and very well explained. And then he kind of moves into kind of how people learn grammar. And he's going against the dominant model in the English language teaching industry, which is a presentation, practice, produce model. The idea that the teacher kind of presents the grammar, the students practice it, and then the students are expected to produce it, and then that's the grammar done. Then you've learned the grammar. And he says, actually, it doesn't work like that. For one thing, like when the students are concentrating on the message of what they want to say, they don't have any kind of resources left to attend to the grammar. So you can't walk and chew gum at the same time, at least not in the beginning stages. For another thing, like the path students make towards grammatical accuracy is kind of like this. It's not a straight path from presentation to practice to produce. It's like this windy path where they're kind of getting it, and then they kind of backtrack, and then they get confused about something, and then like they get there in the end. Some of them get there in the end, but it's not like this linear model that's kind of presented in like the CELTA course or something like that, where you present, practice, and then they produce it, and then like that's that grammar point done. So he presents another model, which is kind of not, it's not over a 90-minute lesson plan. It's like, he doesn't give it an exact time frame here, but I'm imagining like this is kind of taking place over months, or for maybe certain grammar points, years maybe, I don't know. But definitely like more than 90 minutes. Is over the course of at least several days, weeks. Where the learner is exposed to massive amounts of input. And then the learner starts to notice certain things in the input. Now, Thornberry makes a case, which I guess is, maybe what would distinguish him from Krashen or something. Thornberry makes this case that maybe left to themselves, the learner's not going to notice a lot of things in the input. So you kind of have to push them a little bit to notice this kind of stuff, kind of consciousness raising tasks, which, you know, could come through formal instruction. I suppose Thornbury's not a fan of the presentation stage of grammar, but could be a presentation, huh? Why not? Where you just say to the learner, okay, this is the grammar point. But then, like, they can't immediately produce it. You're just kind of raising their consciousness of it. And then they start to notice it in the input. Now, it was always there in the input, but like they never noticed it before. And after you've been taught it, then you start to notice it everywhere in the input. Like, oh, right, you know, that's the thing I learned last week. Somebody just said it. Which, you know, he gives examples from kind of language learners and kind of applied linguists who are keeping like diaries of learning language where this phenomenon is attested. This has also been true in my own experience, like learning Japanese in Japan. After something is pointed out to you in the classroom, you begin to kind of notice it. Like out in the streets. And then after you notice it, then you're paying attention to it. And after you kind of start paying attention to it, then you kind of experiment with using it. And you don't get it right the first time, but you know, you kind of try it out and you get feedback. The feedback is kind of maybe in the form of like people saying, what are you saying? I don't understand you. Like, that's a form of feedback. Or in the classroom setting, it could be the teacher kind of giving you a more direct form of feedback. And then eventually, kind of through this feedback, you kind of eventually maybe finally acquire the language item. Which is a lot longer and more complex than the presentation practice produce stage. But Thornbury is saying that presentation practice produce, they're not actually going to learn it that way. At least they're not going to learn it by the end of the production lesson. So this appeals to me a lot, and it's partly appeals to me, I guess, because this isn't the first time I encountered it. Rod Ellis argues something similar in a book I read maybe 3 years ago or something like that. It's also my own anecdotal experience has been that learners do need some sort of help with the grammar. They do need some kind of grammar instruction, but they also just need massive amount of input. Like, you can't, in my experience teaching grammar, you cannot just kind of teach them a grammar point and then expect them to use it. You have to kind of give them a lot of input and then kind of help them as the grammar is kind of emerging. So my anecdotal experience kind of matches up with what he's saying here. And also, Rod Ellis, who I read a couple of years ago, was saying the same thing, and that resonated with me at the time. There is a reservation, though. And the reservation is the massive amounts of input. Like, where are they going to get the massive amounts of input? And it's something Thornbury doesn't really address in here. Well, no, actually, that's not fair. He does address this. He talks about how the teacher is an important source of input. Which again kind of goes back as against what they say on the CELTA, where you're supposed to reduce your teacher talking time. Actually, quick digression. One of the guys in the book club, he kind of lost points in one of his formal observations because he had a high teacher talking time. And just about all these books we've been reading on the book club have been saying, no, the teacher is a valuable source of input. Teacher talking time is good, can be good. So he was saying, I'm just, one of these days I'm going to collect a whole list of everything we've been reading from these book clubs about how teacher talking time isn't bad, and just kind of show it to my manager, put it right in front of her face. It goes against like the traditional orthodoxy, the CELTA orthodoxy, I guess. So back to the point. Thornbury kind of views the teacher as a kind of source of input. But if you're in an English as a foreign language setting, like I'm teaching English here in Vietnam, the teacher only sees the students for a limited amount of hours per week. In my class, it's 4 hours a week is all I get them. And apparently, in order to do any good, the input needs to be above 6 hours a week. Now I say apparently because that's not in Thornberry's book. That's something I picked up from another source, which is a TEFL show, which is a podcast about teaching English as a foreign language, which is an interesting podcast. You know, if you go over there, check them out. But they had a show on crashing, and they cited that study that says, comprehensible input begins to have positive effects when it's over 6 hours a week, but under 6 hours a week, it has no effect. It doesn't seem to be doing any good. Now, I kind of just took them at their word because I trust these guys. Like, they seem to know what they're talking about. But as I was kind of, reading this book and kind of thinking about this, I thought, maybe I better look that up. So I kind of Googled input 6 hours a week and then less than 6 hours a week. And long story short, I spent some time Googling and I couldn't find this kind of backed up anywhere. But then again, I wouldn't find it. I mean, if it was out there, I probably wouldn't find it because all this stuff is kind of locked behind like the paywall, where if you're not working at a university, you don't have access to any of these journals where this stuff is published. So like, it's not going to show up on Google. You would have needed to pay LexisNexis or something like that, which you couldn't possibly do as an individual. Like, only universities can afford it. The fact that ordinary people don't have access to this research is a travesty, but that's a political issue. That's a different topic. That's not for today. That's a different discussion. So I couldn't find it, but it may well be out there in a journal. Assuming, for the sake of argument, that this fact is accurate, that less than 6 hours kind of no benefit, then Thornberry's model here is not maybe going to work in an English as a foreign language environment as much as it appeals to me. I haven't given up on it completely. I still, in my class, do a lot of input-based activities. We do like a story time. We do kind of movies with movie worksheets and all these input activities. But it is something in the back of my mind, which is like, is it enough? Now, it would be enough, of course, if they sought out input outside of class. Now, they're in a foreign language environment, but, in this day and age, globalization, internet, YouTube, you can get plenty of input outside of class. But they don't. I mean, like, I don't follow them home, but like, I know most of these students are not studying English outside of class. I'm 90% sure that 90% of them are not studying English outside of class. So like, they could be getting the input, but they're not. So yeah, so if they're not getting the input that's necessary for this model, then maybe, I don't know, maybe just go back to the PPP method. Like, you present something, you practice, they may or may not produce it at the end, but they've got a grammar lesson and everyone's kind of happy with it, and then test them on it. And the test is usually controlled practice anyway, so I don't know. I have reservations about whether this works in an EFL environment, I guess, is the long and the short of it. The other thing I had reservations about, no, actually, sorry. Let me set this up before I say what I have reservations about. The other thing he said in here is actually, even given all those conditions, learners will always kind of opt for the easy way out. So even if they're getting lots of input and you direct their attention to stuff and they start noticing stuff, he says, like, it's just such restructuring the brain to accommodate the new grammar is such a huge cognitive effort that the brain just won't do it unless you kind of shock it into doing it. Like, you kind of give it a reason why it has to absorb this new grammar. So the example he gives is the past simple and the present perfect. And he's got this example. He always uses anecdotes from his own class, which, is what I love about Scott Thornberry. It makes him very reasonable. they're doing these, sorry, not reasonable, readable. They're doing these drills on the present perfect. And then he mentions kind of an Egyptian singer. This is in Egypt. And one of the students say, "Did you know her?" And he says, "Oh, what are we practicing? We're practicing the present perfect. Why did you use the past simple?" But then he says that the reason the student did that is because we were just drilling the form and there was no connection to meaning. So he says in order to get them, to force them to use the grammar point, you have to create some sort of scenario where the meaning of the meaning kind of hinges on whether you're using the present perfect or the past simple. He gives the example of a phone call between three people, and one of them is asking questions, and one of them is still on vacation, and one of them's come back from vacation. So the one that has come back from vacation answers the questions in the past simple because it's in the past, and the one who's still on vacation would use the present perfect to answer the questions because they're still on the vacation. Or like, you know, he says, or you can give them the sentences and then they have to decide, okay, is this person still on vacation or have they come back from vacation? And he says by doing that you force them to actually use the grammar to create the meaning, which is what you have to do to acquire the grammar, he says. And that made sense to me as far as it goes, but then I thought, but yeah, but you can't do that for everything. Because like, there's a whole bunch of grammar that actually doesn't carry a lot of meaning with it. The most obvious example is the third person S, which if you've taught English, this is notoriously difficult to get learners to use accurately. I read, he reads. But even in my context in Vietnam, and I think this is true of a lot of countries, even at advanced levels, they do not do the subject-verb agreement accurately. We're remembering the third person S. And the thing about the third person S is it carries absolutely no meaning with it, or at least no meaning that can't be found somewhere else in the sentence. Like, it does indicate that it's a third person subject, but you already knew that because you start off with he. I was reading somewhere, and I forget which author I read this, but they said if the third person singular S would disappear from English tomorrow, we would lose nothing. Like, there's absolutely kind of no meaning or no complexity or anything created by it. It's just completely redundant, just kind of something that native speakers do it intuitively, so it doesn't bother us. But just like non-native speakers have to learn this stupid rule for like no apparent reason. So like, how do you create meaning-based exercise among the third-person singular S? And then I think a lot of grammar points. I mean, that's the most obvious example. But like, the difference between much and many. Many goes with countable nouns, much goes with uncountable nouns. Learners are always messing this up. But like, if you use many with an uncountable noun, meaning's still the same. Like, it sounds strange to native English speakers. It kind of like, we're like, oh, that wasn't right. But like the meaning is perfect. The meaning gets perfectly across. So yeah, stuff like that. I thought, I don't know. Although, to be fair to Scott Thornberry, he does actually say there is another factor. So there's, and I think maybe this is where things like the third person S might come in. He says there's a communicative pressure to be intelligible. This is his grammar on, this is his diagram on how grammar is formed. But he also says there's the social pressure to conform. You kind of want to be seen as like a fluent English speaker, or you want to be seen as a member of the target community. And learners who have, I think they call this, I don't think Thornbury uses this term, but other authors have called this integrative motivation, something like that. Integral, the the desire to kind of integrate into the target language community as much as possible would cause learners to kind of pay attention to this, and learners who want to be seen as like, you know, part of the culture tend to acquire this stuff, and learners who don't want to be seen as part of the target culture or aren't bothered by it either way just kind of never acquire this stuff. So he gives examples of like immigrants who've lived in England for like 20 years but still just haven't acquired these target features, and they're just not bothered because they're perfectly fine as being seen as the Italian who speaks pidgin English. They don't want to be seen as an Englishman. So yeah, how does that translate into English as a foreign language environment? It probably doesn't. I don't know. Yeah, so what else about this book? Oh, lots of good practical ideas. The kind of the last 40 pages are copyable ideas. So like, you know, teachers always love a book that gives them practical ideas for the classroom. And yeah, like in fact, somebody in the book club said, you know, I love the fact that I can take this directly into the classroom. So, you know, you can photocopy this and take it directly into the classroom. This is a cool idea. This is for grammatical complexity. So they roll the die and they go around and they pick up either words. No, I guess, sorry, the words are over here. There are two of these. The words are over here, and then the grammar is over here, like the third person S, the ing, the not. And they kind of write it down whenever they kind of get on it. And then they can make a sentence if they acquire enough of these, and they get like 1 point for every sentence over 4 words. That's just one example. There are a lot of kind of good activities in here and ideas. Actually, one thing which I've gotten very good mileage of and I've taken directly to my classroom is, you can't see it here, but the 4-3-2 technique. So this is the idea. They've got some sort of a speaking task, and the first time you give them like 4 minutes to tell their story. And then the next time they do it with another partner and they get 3 minutes to tell their story. And then the third time they do it with a different partner and they've got 2 minutes to tell their story. And so like the time decreases every time. And the idea is that each time they get more fluent and more accurate. So the idea is the first time they're telling their story, they're stumbling through everything because they haven't really thought out what they want to say yet, or even if they have, that is their first time trying to fumble through it. So they're getting all the grammar wrong. It's taking them forever to remember the words that they want to use. They're going like, what was that word? But then they do it again. And this time they've got kind of all the words at the front of their brain. They know what they want to say. So they have the cognitive space, the attention left to attend to the grammar. And then they do it a third time, and you know, by now they're getting really fluent and they're paying a lot of attention to the grammar, and some really good grammar is starting to emerge. So the idea of kind of task repetition, he says task repetition is kind of really important for these activities to allow kind of students to use grammar and kind of free production. And so I've been using this in my class. I started doing this activity with my adult pre-intermediate class, which I call Telling Your Stories, where I give them a speaking prompt and I have them kind of tell a story with 4-3-2, except I find 4 minutes is actually way too long. Most adult students can't possibly talk for 4 minutes. So I've adjusted this. I've adjusted the timing on this. In fact, what is he thinking, 4 minutes? Like, who can talk for 4 minutes? So anyway, I've cut the timing way down on that. I've got more to say, but I'm out of time. So I'm going to finish off here, and that's it.